whenever is one node above the other node, it means it affects the other node. Another important thing is called the distance. It is the number of nonlinearity between the two nodes. So normally if we have differential fold analysis, we want to have just one nonlinear operation between two nodes. Because if you have too much nonlinearity, the complexity of the attack raises in a way that we might not be able to actually do the attack. So let's take the data flow graph again, and let me explain some of the properties. For example, the first edges are linear. The end is nonlinear edge because it performs a nonlinear operation. Yeah, as I mentioned, whenever a node is above some other node, it affects the other node. And then we have the distance. So whenever we have nonlinear edge corresponding to a nonlinear operation, the distance between the two nodes is 1. Whenever there is a linear edge, such as XOR, the distance is 0. So this means basically the distance between these two nodes is 1, but also the distance between these two nodes is 1. And that tells us we can actually observe the nonlinear changes in case a fault is injected here directly from the ciphertext node. Yeah, this is just the real example of how a data flow graph of full crypto implementation looks like. So this example is for AES. It has thousands of nodes, so it is really hard to analyze it in case we don't have the automated methods to help us. So next we go on finding vulnerable instructions. When we find a vulnerable instruction, we check its input nodes. So that means the two operands of the instruction. So you can imagine it from the very first example about AND. A and B are the operands or input nodes. So each of the nodes can be either target node or a vulnerable node. And we inject a fault into the vulnerable node in a way that it gives us, or it might give us, the information about the target node. So we mark all of these nodes, and we create a small data flow graph of the propagation for each of these. So we take all the nonlinear instructions, and we take subgraphs leading from the input nodes of these vulnerable instructions all the way to some of the known nodes, so that we can see the propagation. So the first step is to identify the instructions. So here we know in this small sample cipher there's only one such instruction, which is AND, and then we create the subgraph. So this is basically the portion of the graph you saw before, but we leave out all the unnecessary details. So we just take the operands of the AND, then we take the data we want to recover, so in this case the portions of the secret key, and we take the nodes we know. So in this case, these two nodes are known to us. And then we continue with creating the equations corresponding to this subgraph. So again, we take the normal execution and create equations which correspond to this part of subgraph. Then we consider the equations whenever a fault is injected. and we also get some equations corresponding to fault mask. So basically, the delta is the value by which we change the original intermediate value of the algorithm. After we have the equations, we can create the inputs to the SMT solver. So those are basically the huge formulas I shown before. So this is basically done automatically, and okay, this algorithm just shows the attacks, how to attack two types of instructions, so bitwise AND or bitwise OR, and it calls the SMT solver. The information we get from this algorithm is true if we can basically recover the information by attacking one of the nodes. So if the algorithm tells us true, so it means the vulnerable instruction is actually exploitable. We get all the attack details of this attack. So how to attack the vulnerable node, what information it will give us regarding the target node. And it updates the known nodes in our graph. So we can see the original graph has 4 known nodes. After we do the attack, we can recover one of the key nodes, which is done by getting information about one of the operands of the AND instruction. So now instead of 4 known nodes, we have 6 known nodes, and we ask whether we have recovered all the portions of the secret key. So not yet. We still need to do almost the same attack, but now we exchange the vulnerable and the target node to get the information about the other one, and that will give us finally all the nodes in this simple cipher. So then we can finish with success. So that was a very simple cipher, but of course we can run the same automated thing for a full cipher implementations. In this slide, you can see what are the results. We were running it for 4 algorithms. So Simon and Spec are the newest lightweight algorithms from NSA. Pride is another lightweight algorithm. AES, I suppose you know. It's a current NIST standard for symmetric crypto. So the number of lines of code differs significantly. So for example, for Spec algorithm, the number of lines is relatively low, but for AES it goes over 2,000. Similarly to this is number of the nodes and the edges in the data flow graph. So this means how big the data flow graph is and how much we actually need to analyze. And then there is another important parameter, which is the evaluation time. So for the 3 lightweight ciphers, the evaluation time is actually very fast. It's just several minutes. So this means whenever the implementer wants to implement a cipher and do countermeasures, it is really easy to do it iteratively. So he implements the cipher, he checks which parts are vulnerable, and then he adds the countermeasures, and again he does the automated evaluation and gets information on what was corrected and what types, what vulnerabilities still remain. In case of AES, the time of evaluation is slightly higher, so it's several hours. However, we still think it is relatively practical, because if you want to analyze the data flow graph like you saw in the previous slides for AES, it really takes very long time. Okay. Maybe we can have a 5-minute break before the last part. Are there any questions regarding the fault attacks in general, or the automation of fault attacks? Okay, so we can continue with the last part of the talk, which are the countermeasures. So once we gain the insight on how vulnerable our algorithm is, our implementation, and also which parts are vulnerable, then we can go on and decide on how to implement the countermeasures. So probably the most popular countermeasure in the industry is just the simple duplication or triplication, or they even do 4, 5, 6 redundant circuits. So it can be either area or time redundancy. So by the area, we mean we take the chip and we implement several circuits on the chip, and then we have some majority voting to decide on the outcome. If we have time redundancy, we basically do the encryption several times in a row. And again, we store the result from each encryption, and then we can do some majority voting. Of course, all of these things have very expensive overheads. If we implement several circuits, especially if we have some heavyweight ciphers like AES, it takes quite a significant area on the chip. Similarly, if you have a time redundancy, normally you don't want to wait, let's say, a couple of seconds until your transaction with your credit card is done. So this is another thing to consider. So it is important to know whether we really need such a high redundancy if we might not even be able to do such a attack. So what we are looking at is, for example, whether we need to do the entire cipher redundant, or we can only do the redundant couple of last rounds, and that will be enough to protect against faults. So we take the implementation and we take the information on the vulnerabilities which were previously analyzed by the automated tool. Here we just slightly change the terminology, because now since if the attack was found, the node is not only vulnerable, but it's provably exploitable. So we can just call it exploitable for this reason. So let's say we have the entire data flow graph, and we have the exploitable nodes distributed somewhere along the, most probably the last round. And we are looking at which are the earliest nodes possible which can affect these exploitable rounds. So we are again checking the propagation in the data flow graph in a way that we can find a node which, if we flip the value of this node, it will also flip the value of the exploitable node, but no other node which somehow can collide with this. I will explain it later. So this information will basically tell us what is the earliest round when the fault attack on this exploitable node can be applied. Let's take back our example, but in order to demonstrate this, let's just add one more round. So everything is the same. We still have one AND instruction in one round. And we still have two key nodes which are added into the intermediate values. And we now focus on on the same part. So we focus on the last nonlinear instruction, which is the end, and we have our two nodes. So we consider one as target, the other one as exploitable, and vice versa. So the question we ask when we want to know how to do the countermeasures, how can we attack R0? So how can we attack our target node in this case? So of course, the easiest way is just to inject the faults directly in this R05. We can extend by one more node. Basically, whenever we change some bits in this node, it will directly change the bits in the R05 and nothing else. We can take it even one more node up in the same way. But if we extend it to another node, we notice that actually this node affects not only this side of the branch, but it kind of continues to the other branch. And this causes a collision, because now, if we look at our known node, if we inject the fault into here, it will propagate to our known node through this path, and it will also propagate through this path. So this will prevent us to actually know what happened there and what kind of fault happened in each of the branches. So when we divide it into the rounds, we can see that the earliest node we can affect is here. So as a result, we basically extended our attack by one more round earlier. So let's take the results for the AES. So as you know, AES has 10 rounds. And when we take the 16 vulnerable nodes in the last round, we can check how can we affect them without the collisions in the previous rounds. So such analysis told us, okay, the earliest round is actually round 7. And among these attacks, we also found an attack which actually corresponds to the current state of the art, which is just a single fault attack on AES. As I mentioned before, here the MDS matrix actually helps to distribute the fault. So if we inject the fault in round 8, somewhere before the mixed columns, the mixed columns distribute this single fault into the entire column, and later the shift rows basically shifts the row in a way that there will be one faulty byte in each column. And then when we move into round 9, there is another mixed column which will distribute the fault from each of the bytes in each column into all the columns. So this is a single fault attack on AES, and so far it is also the most efficient attack. And then when we analyze the other ciphers, we will basically get the results on how many rounds we need to protect to prevent the attacks that were proven to be exploitable. And especially for ciphers which have a huge number of rounds, if we only need to protect a couple of last rounds, it saves a very significant amount of resources. So for example, for Simon, which has 32 rounds, we can only find the attack on the nodes which are in the last 3 rounds. So this means we can actually save over 90% of resources compared to duplicating the entire circuit. So we only need to duplicate the last 3 or 4 rounds. Similarly, for the other ciphers, it can really save a significant amount of resources. So we are saving either the time for the transaction, or we are saving the size of the chip, which ultimately leads to reduction of the price. Okay, so to recap this talk, so far all the block ciphers have been shown to be vulnerable against DFA. I've shown how to inject such faults into the device. We can have several fault injection techniques. I have also shown how to exploit these faults and how to extend this by automating the analysis. These automated methods can really find vulnerabilities very fast without the need of human intervention. So we can iteratively test the implementations, and the same way we can guide the implementation of countermeasures, which we can test over and over again until we know that our implementation is really secure. In case you want to check this into more detail, feel free to check the papers, which are freely available at ePrint archive. Also, in case you are interested in the topic, feel free to go into my website. There are more works into this direction, and I am also putting all my papers here. Yeah, there is also a book we compiled several automated techniques from many authors who are currently publishing in this area. I believe if your university has a subscription to Springer, you can just download this for free. And yeah, that's the end of my talk. Feel free to ask questions in case you are interested. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you.